We wanted to touch a little bit more on the video from a couple of weeks ago talking about controlling sustain. We talked about the floor tom and ways to bring down the sustain if you need to, and ways to bring in a little more if you're struggling to get enough. With something like a rack tom, it's a little bit trickier because there are so many different ways that they could be mounted, and each drum's going to, of course, behave a little bit differently, and we're just going to touch on a couple of sort of options today. This drum today is a Pearl Masters. It's a 9x12, and it is attached with an Optimount that attaches to each of the little tension rods, both top and bottom. Now, the standard rims mount, like the rims brand mount, and also DW standard mounts and things like that, they're sort of attached to the top side of the drum. They don't actually reach all the way to the bottom. So this is a little bit of a different thing. I think that Sonor has a mechanism like this also. And it affords a extraordinary amount of sustain out of a rack tom. And sometimes it's too much, frankly. And instead of, jumping to moon gels and things like that, there are some other kind of like quick ways to circumvent that. And likewise, it's also just sort of vogue right now to have rack toms on snare stands. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take this very, very, very sustainy drum on its very sustainy suspension mount and try it out this way, try it out on a snare stand, and also try a couple of tunings to compare and see like what's more effective with one and the other. So firstly, we're on the suspension mount right now. We're tuned mid-range, maybe just a little bit on the higher side of mid-range. Let's not worry about the notes. You can just kind of listen to it and see how it's behaving today. So it's a nice round note. It sounds really good. The bottom head is just slightly higher than the batter, sort of a very standard thing. And since we have the suspension mount, there isn't actually anything penetrating the drum shell in order to mount it. It's all externalized. And that means that the wood is free to resonate as much as it possibly can. And it also means that the heads can interact with each other for much, much longer than if there was sort of like an old school, like you'd see on a vintage kit, mount that is drilled directly into the side of the drum. When you put a mount directly through the wood, what ends up happening is you're creating a node of pressure that when the drum is hung by that, it's pulling ever so slightly on the wood as the drum is trying to resonate and creating a dead spot. And that dead spot, depending on the drum, the weight of the drum, the size of it, can really affect the sustain. It can really affect the tuning range. And frankly, with some larger drums, it can actually be hard on the shell. It can pull it out of round after a while if it's just left like that, if the shells are very thin. This goes more for vintage mounts that are like a post style where it slips onto the post and mounts. The old kind of like Gretsch and some other brands that have a sort of consolette holder on the bass drum that's just a piece like this that the drum slides onto. It's not actually crimped onto that with a wing nut or anything like that, so there's a little more sustain with those, but they're also just kind of floating there on that thing. They're just loose, just gravity's holding them on, and that's a little dicey too. So, the invention of these kind of suspension mounts has circumvented all of that. It limits the amount of holes drilled in the drum and doesn't introduce any off-center nodes to screw with the resonance. On my drum set at home, it did have a mount drilled into it, which I removed because I don't mind putting it on a snare stand. I feel like I get enough sustain out of that, and I kind of prefer the look personally anyway. So since we've heard this drum, let's find out what happens when we move it to a snare stand. We're just going to set it on a standard Yamaha snare stand, not change the tuning at all, and just see what happens. All right, so now we got it on the stand. And again, same tuning, didn't change anything. Made sure to tighten down this wing nut so it won't rattle when we play because it's not holding on to anything anymore. And see what this sounds like. So with this situation, some of the fundamental tone is reduced because the weight of the drum is sitting on the snare stand, including the weight of all of this mechanism. And It's a little bit of a shorter sound. It's a little bit of a punchier sound. It's a little less melodic and a little more percussive, which I find to be pretty pleasant. In this situation too, it's important to note that not all snare stands are created equal with regards to putting a tom on them. This one is straight, where like the basket is directly on top of the tripod, versus some other ones where it's sort of offset, like the basket is a little bit to the side and sort of moves like that when you're adjusting the tilt. And the offset baskets are like, imagine like it's the standard like DW stands. They afford the drum more sustain because they are sort of suspending it off center from the center of gravity of the stand. So you can kind of split the difference with how much sustain you want to remove from your rack tom by choosing different stands. Some vintage stands that are thinner and smaller and maybe flat based will actually cut too much out, and you might want to move to a different one to get some of that tone back. And again, same with the floor tom thing. I like this approach because it's non-invasive. Some people suggested things like putting cotton balls inside of the floor tom, which is totally effective and that works, but that also means that it's inside the drum and you're stuck with that unless you want to take the heads off and fuss with it. This being an external solution means that you can try it, and if it's not working, like in a recording session or something, you've only spent a couple of minutes rather than 10 or 20 minutes taking the drum apart, looking around inside, and having to put the heads back on and all that kind of thing. One thing that does happen with this kind of setup where you're reducing the fundamental by putting it on a snare stand is that the overtones of the head become a little bit more prominent, and that leads me sometimes to tune the drum a little bit differently if I know I'm going to put it on a stand. When it's on a suspension mount, it's so resonant that you can get away with a lot of different intervals, and at the same time, subtle tuning changes don't actually make as much of a difference when it's suspended that way because the whole thing is already so resonant. And with a situation like this, you're going to hear a bigger effect from a small change in the tuning. And just sort of to illustrate that, without getting into what I'm going to do, I'm going to pretend that I sat down at this drum, it's at a gig, I hit it, it sounds okay, and I want it to be better for me. Okay, so I fussed with it a little bit. I went through like 3 different sort of tuning schemes, and as is often the case with mounting it on a stand like this, I ended up raising the reso side a bunch. And I'm not 100% sure what the physics behind this is, but my theory is that since the resonant side hoop is what's sitting on the stand, that head is getting stifled more so than the top, just physically from being pressed into it by gravity. So I raised that one up a little bit so that there's a little more aggression in the resonance of that head to help bring some tone out the top. So now the batter's not far off from where it was before. It's maybe just a fraction lower. What we have now is something with a little bit more tone than it had before on here, but not as long of a sustain as when it was on the suspension mount. That feels like a nice combination of percussive punch and also a little bit of tonal sustain there. And if I lowered the resonant head a fraction of a turn, a lot of that sustain would go away. But now, here is where we find out what we've really done. I want to put it back on the suspension mount with this tuning and see how it compares to what we have right now. This is the same tuning, we didn't change anything, we just came off the snare stand and now we're back on the suspension mount, and we're going to find out, compared to that, what the sustain is like now. So it has a little bit more sustain, but there's also kind of a crazy pitch bend and a little bit of like bloom in the note when it's suspended this way that we didn't hear when it was on the stand, which is, again, one of those things like you never know till you try. There's sort of loose rules about it, but it's all about just chasing a sound you have in your head. And also what is most convenient to your setup, frankly. For me, carrying around stands that are robust enough to hold toms, especially suspended floor toms, isn't practical. And so a very lightweight snare stand can make a great tom mount, and then you can have lighter cymbal stands, and ultimately the whole sort of weight footprint of your rig just goes down. makes it easier on your back, and it fits in the car. Let us know what your favorite mounting scenario is and why you do it, and maybe if you have a specific tuning scenario that you use with that mounting rig. Yeah, we're always curious. These are all sort of opinions. These aren't really rules. They're just, what works for you, what works for me. And let us know in the comments, like, subscribe, and stay tuned. We got a bunch more great stuff coming down.